Welcome to Book Launch, the UK's most widely distributed books magazine for all intellectual interests. And in this podcast we're asking, how could we have missed the political similarities between Britain's Jeremy Corbyn and America's Donald Trump? For all their apparent differences, Labour Party insiders have seen much in common between the two. Here's Dimitri Petruni to explain.
One of the most fascinating aspects of the conversation about Corbynism, globalisation and Brexit was the association some MPs saw between Corbyn and Trump. To be clear, given the sensitivity of making such an association, there was no attempt by MPs to suggest any moral or ideological equivalence. Instead, they premised the association on the rise of populism in reaction to economic and cultural changes wrought by globalisation. And there are distinct versions of it that can be categorised broadly as left-wing, Corbyn, and right-wing, Trump. The left-wing version of a backlash against globalisation was what anti-Corbyn MPs were referring to. An MP sceptical of the Corbyn project explained that the rise of Corbyn and the rise of Trump is anchored in the same starting position, which is the friction between globalisation and national politics. Emily Thornberry, Labour MP for Islington South and Finsbury, recognised some similarities between Corbynism and Trumpism on their anti-establishment message and on an economic system that simply isn't working for most people. During an interview on BBC Radio 4, Corbyn responded to this proposed similarity, commenting that it was a very strange comparison and that they shared nothing in common. Indeed, Corbyn refused to attend a state visit banquet in Trump's honour. On many levels, Corbyn was right that he and Trump shared nothing in common. However, when it came to the economic sphere, there were some similarities, as Thornberry alluded to. This view was shared by a few MPs in the PLP, who saw connections between Trumpism and Corbynism in relation to economic nationalism and the populism that came along with taking that position. A shadow minister observed how Trump was a reaction to industrial decline in the US, and appealed to those American voters who had seen their traditional industry leave their home states and viewed the residents of both the east and west coasts of the US as democratic liberal elites. The parallels of this process were made evident in the UK by the EU referendum. The left-behind communities had seen their traditional industries leave, saw relatively low economic gain from globalisation, and viewed people in the major cities, particularly London, as bastions of economic and cultural elites. In both cases, the argument for economic nationalism, juxtaposed to global free trade, was a potent political message. This was not lost on Corbyn's political advisers. They had noted the similarities and indeed viewed their job as to make Jeremy Corbyn the left's Donald Trump. While Trump and Corbyn did not instigate the rise in populism, they sought to ride the wave it offered their respective political horses. It is controversial to associate Corbynism with populism. There is an argument around whether Corbynism represents populism at all. This is because populism is often seen as a negative and unprogressive political force. This is unfair. Some populist movements are progressive in nature and are labelled populist because they challenge the status quo. In this case, its progressive nature is up for political debate, but it's difficult not to see Corbyn's success as synonymous with anything other than a distinctive brand of populism. This brand has been the basis for Corbyn's success, especially through his leadership victory that galvanised a new radical variant of left-wing populism. Both Trump and Corbyn's aims were to ride the anti-establishment wave. It's important to highlight that MPs were not necessarily lamenting Corbyn for taking this position. Some even had sympathy for it. They noted that Blair's acceptance of rampant economic globalisation helped foment a cultural and economic backlash, and Labour's antidote was Corbynism. A Blairite MP slammed their own group for not coming with ideas on how to deal with the negative consequences of globalisation, enabling the space for populists, both left and right wing, to sweep in and not only speak to people's legitimate grievances, but also to offer them solutions. In other words, the right had no ideas about how to face the populist wave amongst the population, while the left had Corbynism. In of itself, MPs were not dismissive of people being offered solutions to current problems. Rather, their anxieties centred on the perception that Corbynism offered solutions that were not based on new ideas, but rather old ones that offered a nostalgic comfort blanket by referring to a golden past. Once again, here the same accusation could be levelled at Trump, especially around his slogan, "Make America Great Again." It was a reference to a golden past that could be returned to. The draw of nostalgia was intoxicating for many voters, something Blue Labour had noticed nearly a decade before. For many in the PLP, this was the essential problem for Corbynism, particularly and unsurprisingly among MPs who held reservations about Corbyn. In a thoughtful and reflective tone, a moderate Labour MP critical of Corbyn felt that one of the criticisms of Jeremy and Trump is that they are not trying to understand the future and come up with new ideas, but pull us back to where we were in the past. For another backbench MP, who openly declared themselves a Blairite, this argument could be boiled down to the old argument of purity versus pragmatism. In this MP's view, the Corbynistas are so wedded to their own paradigm, they are not open to new ideas and reality. This was probably overstating the position, particularly in relation to MacDonald's concerted effort to incorporate new ideas in order to develop a socialism for the 21st century. Yet the benign elements of Corbynism offered a nostalgic pitch to members of the Labour Party and tried to speak to a broad swathe of voters by offering a return to Britain's industrial past. Both Trump and Corbyn were economic nationalists. Their views on free trade agreements and Brexit were interlinked. Both were Brexiteers, and both were sceptical of free trade agreements with other countries. This was premised on many reasons, but the most pertinent was the perceived negative impact global free trade has on workers at home. Trump continually railed against poor trade deals like NAFTA by focusing on its impact on American jobs. On the EU, Trump's scepticism had stretched back decades, as did Corbyn's. After all, the EU is the epitome of a free trade agenda, with a single market that is underpinned by freedom of movement, capital, goods and services. This was contrary to the agenda of Trump, who frequently threatened trade tariffs with other countries, notably China. These stances formed an anti-neoliberal agenda. It was economic protectionism in action. Corbynism offered the same agenda, albeit with different policies, such as workers on boards who would, presumably, fight against offshoring of jobs. Another point of policy departure was on nationalisation. Trump would never countenance such a policy. However, in reality, it was just a different solution in combating the whims of global capital that Corbyn had decided to take. Although Corbynism was offering different forms of ownership and economic democracy, it was protectionist in nature. Both Trump's and Corbyn's economic nationalism, albeit pursued in different ways, was an anti-neoliberal agenda which had proved popular, resonating on both sides of the Atlantic. Brexit was another example.
That was Dimitri Petruni reading an extract from his new book, The Battle of Ideas in the Labour Party. The book is published by Bristol University Press and is available to buy at a discount from booklaunch.london/sales.